The last chapter that we talked about, chapter 16, focused on the Eurasian discovery of the Americas and the expansion into the Americas and how that dramatically changed life on both the Eastern and Western hemispheres. Today, this lecture is going to focus more on the Eastern Hemisphere, because the important thing to understand is that history is not static. When one place is changing, other places are changing too. And the Eastern Hemisphere was changing partially for some of the same reasons that the Western Hemisphere was changing. And a lot of that stemmed from technology. Now, guns and gunpowder had originally been discovered in China, as far as we can tell, in the 13th century. I mean, the first evidence there ever was of a gun being shot in a battle was around 1275 or so in China. But by the time we get to the period that we're talking about now, the 1500s, from about 1500 to 1600, gunpowder has really become an effective weapon, become an effective source of weaponry. The musket had been developed, rifles, handguns were being developed. I mean, handguns were not as effective at this time, but they were still being developed. And most importantly, I wouldn't necessarily most importantly, but most dramatically, the cannon had been really, really perfected. People were able to use cannons from stationary targets, like, for instance, on the walls of cities to protect cities. Cannons had been developed that could be deployed from ships. There were cannons on wheels that could be carried by horses that could be used on the battlefield, the mobile cannons that could be used on the battlefield. And so what this meant was that those political entities that were able to get control of firearms were able to expand dramatically. And so this chapter starts off looking at powers in Western Asia, all the way over to Central Asia. In particular, it looks at the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. The Ottoman Empire was centered around what nowadays is the nation of Turkey, and it expanded to control most of the Near East. What nowadays would be Lebanon, Syria, a little bit of Iraq, but Persia mainly got that. But into Egypt, into North Africa, up to Morocco. And they would eventually control the Red Sea. Now, in addition to controlling this area, the Ottoman Empire would become the major power on the Black Sea. They would control the Black Sea on both the northern and the southern coast for about 250, 300 years. And the Ottoman Empire also expanded significantly into southeastern Europe. It controlled Greece. It controlled what nowadays is Albania. It controlled the countries of the former Yugoslavia. That would be Serbia, Montenegro, Croatia, Slovenia. I mean, not Slovenia. I can't remember it right now. But, it's the country that, I can't remember it. It's the country that Melania Trump comes from. But he controlled those territories. In addition to that, the Ottomans would get Hungary. They would get Bulgaria. They would take control of Romania. And as the book mentions, they would expand as far. They would expand far enough into Europe to actually attack Vienna, the capital of Austria. Now, they weren't successful in taking Vienna, but the point to be made is that they were quite powerful. Now, the Ottoman Empire was in a lot of ways was a classic empire, in the sense that it really absorbed a lot of ethnicities. In the Ottoman Empire, you had Arabs, you had Jewish community, you had a number of different Christian communities, especially in the European side. It had Kurds, it had Berbers in North Africa. The Kurds, would have been in Eastern Anatolian Peninsula, and in in what nowadays is northern Iraq. So it was a very, very, very diverse empire. Now, it was also religiously diverse because it had, once the empire got to its full size, it had a slight Muslim majority, but there were major portions of the empire where the overwhelming population was Christian. And this would have been most of the areas of Eastern Europe. Now, there are some majority Muslim areas in Eastern Europe, Albania, Bosnia. But outside of Albania and Bosnia, the majority of Eastern Europe was majority Christian. Now, there were also significant Christian minorities in the Middle Eastern territories too. For instance, what nowadays is Israel and Palestine, back at the time of the Ottomans, was probably about 35% Christian, had a significant Jewish population, and had a Muslim majority. And Egypt also had a significant Christian population. And so therefore, it was a very, very diverse community. Now, as the book mentions, the Ottoman system of government was not egalitarian. Muslims have more rights and more privileges than non-Muslims. And in particular, the people who were at the top were people of Turkish background. Now, within this system, however, the Ottomans had what was known as the Millet system. And the Millet system basically allowed different religious communities to have autonomy in their non-state affairs. In other words, when people got married, people got divorced, a lot of their day-to-day life was controlled by religious authorities. And so therefore, if you were a Christian, the bishops or local religious authorities they were in charge of a lot of the personal affairs of people. For Jewish people, it would have been the various rabbis who would have been in charge. And although the Muslims were the majority, this was a similar situation. Various local qadis or Muslim judges would have been in charge of the private affairs of people. And so this allowed people to live in a community with each other. To put it this way, they lived in the same community, but communities were able to establish their own zones. I mean, you did not have integration or diversity as one would expect it nowadays in the United States. But these different communities had autonomy while recognizing the rule of the Ottoman Sultan. Now, the Ottomans also became a sea power. As I said earlier, they were dominant in the Red Sea. They became a major presence in the Persian Gulf. Excuse me. And they also made contact with Muslim kingdoms or principalities in Southeast Asia. In places like Sumatra, a number of other areas, they were able to make contact with people. And the Ottomans were essentially able to be a counterbalance to European expansion because, the Portuguese had expanded into Southeast Asia. Later, the Dutch would come. But the Ottomans were able to supply cannons and other things to, like to the rulers, the sultans in places like Aceh, and a number of other communities, that would now be in Malaysia or Indonesia or Brunei and a number of the other countries in that area. Now, in addition to the Ottoman Empire, just like to the east, you had the Safavid Empire, which controlled most of what nowadays is Iran. Now, the Safavids were significant in that they were Shia Muslims. Now, the majority of Muslim population is Sunni, but Iran is distinctive in that historically it had been, Iraq and also Iran had been the areas where Shia Islam, which is a variety of Islam that argued that the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad, Ali, should have been the rightful person to be the first to be the caliph, and that the family of the Prophet, should have been the people who were the successors. Now, over time, of course, the family of the Prophet, dispersed. Now, you have in a lot of Muslim societies, you have people who claim descent from the Prophet. They work out genealogies and everything. But the people that we can easily trace, apparently, they kind of run out, fairly far back in history. But what we see is that in Shia countries, you don't exactly have a priesthood like you have in Christianity, but the various imams and or like the higher-ranking people, the ayatollahs, do become a class of religious leaders, but also legal leaders. And in that level, the fact that you have the combination of religious and legal leadership is pretty similar to what you see in Shia Islam. But the bottom line is that gosh, I can't remember the word right now, but the bottom line is that Shia Islam becomes the dominant religious force in the Safavid Empire. Now, the Safavids and the Ottomans are rivals. But as the book says, the rivalry really did not focus very much on issues of religion. It was not a question of the Ottomans coming in trying to eradicate Shiism, or the Shia coming in trying to eradicate Sunni Islam. The struggle primarily revolved around political power. Now, the Safavids, unlike the Ottomans, did not have a navy, but they were able to maintain a strong land presence in what nowadays is Iraq and Iran. And it's really interesting right now because, of course, right now our own government is involved in conflict with Shia groups in Iraq and Iran. The United States government, very much wants to keep Iranian influence outside of Iraq. But to be honest with you, from the Iranian perspective, they have always been at least they've been influential in that area, for a very long time. Going back into ancient times, and the common Shia version of Islam that predominates in Iraq and in Iran, simply served to tie these two communities together more closely. And so, from the standpoint of the Iranians, the fact that they seek influence or seek to be a dominant force in Iraq, to them, that's just being historically consistent. Now, I know that's getting a little bit off the subject, but since it looks like we're currently in a shooting situation, and it may get worse, I think it's good to give a little bit of a historical perspective to it. Now, further east of Further east of Iran, you have the Mughal Empire, which developed in South Asia. You know what nowadays is Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, a number of other countries. The Mughals came from the northern part of South Asia. You know what nowadays is Afghanistan. Now, the interesting thing about the Mughals is that they came into India, and India, unlike the Middle East further to the west, was never a majority Muslim territory. I mean, South Asia has a very large Muslim population. Between Bangladesh, in modern day South Asia, between Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India itself, there are probably about 400 million Muslims in that area. However, the Hindu population is over a billion. I mean, probably about 1.2 or 1.1 billion Hindus. And then you have other smaller religious groups like Sikhs, Jains, a few Buddhists, a few Christians. But the point to be made is that unlike the Ottoman Empire and unlike the Safavid Empire, Muslims in the Mughal Empire were a minority. I mean, the majority population was Hindu, especially once one started looking a little bit further south. The overwhelming majority of people were Hindu. And so it's not surprising that the Mughal Empire, at least early on, tended to be more tolerant, and especially under the leadership of Akbar, who is considered to be the most successful of the Mughal rulers. He was definitely, exceptionally tolerant. Now, Akbar ruled from 1556 to 1605. And he was noteworthy because, one could argue that he actually became a bit of an apostate, that he didn't exactly follow Islam anymore, and that he really kind of pushed for kind of a universal respect of religion, or to see a universal connection in religion. And so what we see under Akbar is that the government was very much willing to let local Hindu rulers have a status that was the same as Muslim rulers. And Hindus were also allowed to get significant positions in the Mughal civil service. Now, after Akbar passes on, Hindu access to the civil service declines. But there's always a place for the Hindu, local Hindu rulers, because it really is not possible to control this large area without coming to some kind of accommodation with the Hindus. Now, in China at this time, we see the Ming Dynasty continue to be very powerful and very successful economically. I mean, at this time, this period of the 16th century, the 17th century, China far and away has the biggest economy in the world, the strongest, most prosperous economy in the world. And, it's a very, very rich country. Now, that's not to say that China does not have issues or problems. But during this time, China's, pretty much inwardly focused and, maintains itself as the dominant economic power in the world. Now, another country to talk about in Eurasia, a country that straddles Asia and Europe, is Russia. Now, Russia, which, its government has its origins in the region of Muscovy. The capital, of course, is Moscow. Expanded eastwards and southwards from the 16th century going into the 17th century. Eventually Russia would become the biggest country in the world. I mean, Russia goes, America has basically 4 time zones. Eastern Standard Time, Central Standard, well, actually 5, excuse me, I can't count because Eastern, Central, Mountain Time, Pacific Time, and then Alaska and Hawaii are in another time zone. So we have 5 time zones. Russia has 11 time zones. I mean, if you're in St. Petersburg, the people in Vladivostok are 11 hours ahead of you. And so that lets you know just how big Russia is. It's about, from east to west, it's about 6,000 or so miles. The United States, the continental United States is about 3,000, a little bit over 3,000 miles across. Russia is twice as long. And it goes all the way from the Arctic Circle down to the borders of South Asia and the Middle East. Now, Russia is kind of the polar opposite of, say, the Ottoman Empire, in that the Ottoman Empire was a predominantly Muslim empire that managed to incorporate a significant Christian population. The Russian Empire was a predominantly Christian empire that managed to incorporate a significant Muslim population. The areas, basically the areas in the Caucasus, the areas that bordered South Asia, and the areas of Central Asia would eventually be absorbed into Russia, and those were majority Muslim areas. Also, Russia would eventually expand to the borders of China and Mongolia. Like, for instance, Lake Baikal, which is the biggest lake in the world, I mean, not the biggest lake in the world, but one of the biggest freshwater lakes in the world, was actually where Genghis Khan was born. I mean, in other words, back in the 12th century, that would have been part of Mongolia. But nowadays, it's part of Russia. And, people may not realize it, but, modern day Russia borders North Korea, borders China, as well as Mongolia. And then all the way to the west, of course, it borders Poland and it borders Finland, Sweden. Not Sweden, but borders Finland and Poland. And, you also have, it also has a city on the Baltic Sea. And so Russia became a huge continental power. Now, Russia was also a bit distinct from Western Europe, in that it was the one major power in Europe where Orthodox Christianity was dominant, as opposed to the Catholic Church. Now, the significant thing, of course, is that in 1517, all of this would change when the German monk Martin Luther, protesting what he felt was corruption in the church, the sale of indulgences, supposedly to get rid of the sin of the deceased so they would not spend so much time in purgatory. He criticized it. And so in the year 1517, Martin Luther would nail his 95 Theses on the church door wall. And this set off what became known as the Reformation. And this was very significant because what we see is that until this time, the Catholic Church had been, the major cultural glue for Western Europe. Now, Eastern Europe, like I said, was Orthodox, and the Eastern Church and the Roman Church had split back in the year 1054. But in Western and Central Europe, the Catholic Church was dominant. Now, with the Reformation, we see that Protestant churches began to develop. Now, the first churches were known as the Lutheran churches, but eventually, people like John Calvin would come along and develop what would eventually become known as the Presbyterian churches, or or a number of other, like the Dutch Reformed Church. A number of other churches would come out of that. And then you'd also have movements like the Anabaptists and the Baptists, who never controlled governments, but will go on to become major influences in Protestant communities. Now, as your book mentions, one of the things that really helps to spread the Reformation is the fact that you have the printing press technology. Once it becomes possible for people to have books and for language to be printed, for writing to be printed cheaply in books, this really spurs the development of literacy. And it changes things significantly, because, for instance, since the fall of the ancient world back in the 6th century after of the Common Era, really highly educated people tended to learn in Latin and to a lesser degree Greek. But with the printing press, as the book mentions, vernacular education became much more common. People began to learn in the everyday spoken language. And the other thing that's really significant too, and this is something the book talks about in a great deal of detail, is that with the expansion of the empires, there's a decline in linguistic diversity because, as empires take over more and more territory, it makes sense for government to put things out in one language and to really push the education in the direction of people learning the dominant language of the dominant power. And so, as the book mentions, language, over a period of time, the diversity of languages in Europe significantly declines. But to get back to the point of the Reformation, the spread of literacy meant that more and more people could read the Bible and they could read other books. And this is really significant because from the Protestant standpoint, one needed to study the Bible and read the Bible in order to understand it, as opposed to simply taking the proclamations of the religious hierarchy, which had been the way that the Catholic Church had always done things. And so the bottom line is that this period of time is a period where we see significant change. We see consolidation of big empires. We see a degree of homogenization in the population, where there's less linguistic diversity. There's stronger governments. Now, there is more diversity in the sense of religion. But the interesting thing about it is that religious diversity really becomes another way for political leaders to stake out their independence. And so, as I said before, we see a trend of larger political units. We see a trend of less linguistic diversity. But we also see a trend of increasing literacy. And we see a trend of a more informed general population. Well, anyway, that's going to be it for chapter 17. I'll be posting chapter 18 in a day or two. You all have a good day.